Welcome back. A tale of inheritance, silence and rot, drawn from the margins of forgotten archives. Tonight, we descend into a history best left sealed. But the records persist, and so must the telling. Before we continue, like, subscribe and share. The year was 1845 when the first wagons broke through the blackened thickets of Hollow Ridge in the West Virginia mountains. The settlers, 42 families bound by blood, necessity or exile, did not arrive by chance. Their ledgers and their minutes, those few that remain unburnt, tell of a purchase discreetly arranged and of lands secured through channels unfit for the open court. The name that recurs most often is Josiah Henley, a man of scripture and steel, his face preserved in a single tintype, eyes hollowed by resolve, jaw locked as if perpetually in judgment. Henley spoke little, but when he did, the families listened. It was Henley who urged them into the valley, who proclaimed the waters of Burden Creek pure and the slopes fit for wheat. It was Henley who led the men into the gaping wound of an abandoned copper mine and declared it Providence's gift. And it was Henley who ignored the warning. A weathered account, penned by a missionary of the Cherokee Nation, notes that the ridge was once marked with stones carved in spirals and embedded with ash. These were not boundary markers, he wrote, but wards to remind the mountain of its own debts. The settlers removed them within a week, stacking the stones as foundation for the first timber church. The early prosperity of Hollow Ridge is preserved in Reverend Paul Sutterfield's ledger, now warped with damp but legible enough. 1846, wheat yields doubled expectation. Copper assays near Burden Creek show purity unrecorded in any New England survey. The men were jubilant, for copper meant coin and coin meant permanence. They began to speak of schools, of taverns, of grander houses than the rough-hewn cabins that first winter forced upon them. Yet even in these first bright years, the records darken with what they do not say. Margins are blotted, sentences cut short by ink stains or deliberate excision. In Eleanor Cranston's diary, the year turns abruptly from spring to autumn with only the phrase, "The mountain breathes at night." It was in 1847 that the vanishings began. The first was Anna Dietrich, a girl of 15 who had been tending to the wash at Burden Creek. Her apron was found upon a stone, wet but unstained. The second was Marcus Finch, a carpenter whose half-built cart stood unfinished, tools still in place. By year's end, 9 souls had vanished, each absence following the turn of the new moon, each disappearance preceded by a dream of suffocation spoken of only in whispers, and always the tokens. Shoes placed neatly at the threshold of cabin, inside them not feet but clay and pine needles, as though someone or something had sculpted a mockery of what was missing. Around the shoes, villagers claimed to see ravens in impossible numbers, perched in deliberate circles watch. It was Daniel Moss, a huntsman by trade, who first broke silence in the parish hall. He swore that he had followed a trail of bare feet to the mouth of the mine where the prints did not end but sank directly into the earth. Moss said he heard voices below, not cries for help, but a low rhythmic chanting in no language he knew. Henley dismissed him, so did most, but the families continued to vanish. In the parish register of 1847, an unnamed hand wrote in the margins, "Every 90 days the earth requires its due." The phrase has been underlined 3 times in a copper red ink later confirmed to contain traces of human blood. The journal of Dr. Edmund Whitlock, the settlement's physician, remains the most unsettling record of that year. In a fragment labeled only Case 7, Whitlock describes a body retrieved from the riverbank, skin pale as tallow, veins bright with crystalline deposits that gleamed like sawdust struck by flame. He noted with clinical detachment that the blood had hardened into sharp lattices within the heart, as though the very copper of the mountain had infiltrated the man's flesh. He never names the patient. The page ends with 2 words, "returned empty." By autumn of 1847, dissent could no longer be ignored. The families gathered in the church demanding answer. The Cranstons, the Dietrichs, the Mosses, all had lost kin. Rumors of bargains made in secret, of surveys carried out under moonlight, filled the hall with a fury that no sermon could quiet. It was then that Josiah Henley stood, his Bible in one hand, a folded parchment in the other. His words are preserved not in any single account but in fragments. The mountain has kept its covenant since before our coming. We are but stewards of its accounts. There is no prosperity without sacrifice. Some called him mad. Others claimed he was only admitting aloud what they had already known in their marrow. That night the families dispersed in silence. No action was taken, and when the next moon turned, another child was gone. Archivist's note collected 1974, declassified 1992. The founding of Hollow Ridge remains absent from county maps until 1851, 6 years after settlement. Requests for federal surveying filed in 1845 and 1846 are listed as delayed due to duplication. Local Cherokee records, when cross-referenced, reveal stones removed from their traditional placement in precisely the same year. Vanishings commenced. The mountain had been marked. The settlers erased the mark. The Hollow Ridge story begins not in prosperity but in the silence that follows removal. The absence of stones, the absence of kin, the absence of voices, swallowed by the earth. The accounts converge upon one undeniable pattern. Every 90 days the mine demanded a life, and the town gave. By 1848, Hollow Ridge had acquired the look of permanence. Cabins squared with porches, barns braced against the winds, the church crowned with a copper weather vane that caught the pale light of winter suns. To a passerby, it might have seemed a place of providence, yet within its walls, silence grew like mold. No family spoke openly of the vanishings, not in daylight, not in the tavern, not in the company of strangers. Yet each household bore signs of private rituals, bowls of salt left at thresholds, children forbidden from sleeping near windows, fires kept burning long into the small hours of the night. The parish register for 1848 shows 42 baptisms, 14 marriages, and 9 deaths officially recorded, but in its margins appear entries in another hand, cramped and fevered, gone beneath. Ash upon the floorboards, shoes found empty. The handwriting has never been matched to any known member of the community. Unease in the domestic sphere. It is in the diaries of Sarah Henley, Josiah's second daughter, that the private atmosphere of Hollow Ridge is most clearly glimpsed. Preserved in a battered leather book, Library of Appalachian Studies, item H47-3. Her words tremble between innocence and terror. Mother forbids me to look in the mirror after sunset. She says the face I see may not be my own. Last night I dreamt of women bent over copper bowls, washing blood from cloth I did not know. Sarah was 12 years old when she wrote this. In another entry, at supper father spoke to no one. His plate was clean but he had not lifted his fork. When I asked if he was unwell, he only said, "The mountain eats through us all, child. Even when we think we stand upright." The Henley household was not alone. The Cranstons, who had once prided themselves on music, ceased their singing altogether. The Dietrichs, already scarred by loss, kept their shutters barred even at noon, and the Moss family, still mourning their vanished kin, sent petitions to distant relatives begging them not to visit, letters which survive only in draft, unsigned and unsent. The emergence of artifacts. In spring of 1848, Dr. Edmund Whitlock received a delivery of surgical instruments from Philadelphia. The invoice, preserved in county archives, lists the following: 2 sets of steel obstetric forceps, 1 cranial trepan, calipers for craniometric study, a brass-bound case of bone saws, 3 vials of ether compound, and curiously, 3 copper clamps of local manufacture. Why a frontier physician would require such an array of specialized tools is uncertain. His own journal offers only fragments. Patient exhibits calcification not limited to bone. Veins stiff with mineral. Attempted incision reveals resistance akin to ore. Ether, administered but insufficient. Operation abandoned. This patient is never identified, yet an annotation in the same hand, smudged with verdigris stain, reads, "Copper beneath skin, hereditary." Whitlock's clinical detachment faltered. By late summer, his notes blur into the feverish. It is not contagion, it is not diet. It is the mountain's blood. Our children drink it, as though from birth. Even the teeth gleam with it. Whispers of heredity. The idea that Hollow Ridge itself had begun to inscribe its mineral into the flesh of its settlers is corroborated by later testimony. In the oral histories gathered by WPA interviewers in the 1930s, descendants recall Ken born with nails green as tarnish, and tongues that cracked when they prayed. But even in 1840, a letter from Ezekiel Cranston to his brother in Ohio, dated October 1848, never posted but found in a trunk, reads, "The children are not as other children. They tire not, yet sleep as though drowned. Their eyes reflect light in ways I dare not name." Sarah Henley's gaze is fixed always to the earth, as though listening to something beneath. We fear the ridge breeds us anew.
The letter ends abruptly with a dark stain that analysts later confirmed as copper residue. The fire at the schoolhouse. The most striking event of that year was the schoolhouse fire in November. Officially, it was caused by a toppled lantern, but among the scorched timbers, investigators found a series of diagrams carved into the underside of desks, spirals, lattices, and what appear to be anatomical sketches of hands and skulls scored with copper vein. The local constable noted in his report, "Children too young to draw with such exactness. Marks resemble surgical diagrams. Wherefrom they copied, none can say." Only one body was found in the ashes, Thomas Wren, aged. His remains were unusual in a manner that even the blunt language of the coroner could not disguise. Bones exhibited a metallic sheen, as though plated. The fire silenced Hollow Ridge. There was no rebuilding. Children were taught henceforth only at home, by parents who themselves had ceased to trust their own shadows. Suppressed records. By the winter of 1848, outside awareness of Hollow Ridge began to flicker. The correspondent from the Richmond Medical Review visited briefly, drawn by Whitlock's inquiries regarding calcification. His published account, Issue 4, avoids naming the settlement, referring only to a mountain community wherein the mineral has entered the very constitution of its people. The article was recalled within weeks and all extant copies marked withdrawn at the behest of state. Yet one paragraph survives in the archives of a medical society in Baltimore. The most distressing feature lies not in the affliction itself, but in the silence of its witnesses. They comport themselves as though their very survival depends on the secrecy of the soil. It is as though they fear the exposure of what they carry within. Closing unease. By year's end, Hollow Ridge was no longer merely a town marked by disappearances. It had become a living laboratory of heredity and dread. Mothers glanced too long at their children, searching for veins that gleamed when candlelight struck. Fathers drank heavily at the tavern, unable to admit aloud that they feared their sons' bones were no longer wholly human. The parish bells rang on Sundays, but few attended. The church's copper weather vane tarnished to a sickly green, pointing ever north regardless of wind. And in Sarah Henley's final diary entry of that year, written in a hand already stiff with adult gravity, she left this: "Father says the mountain is teaching us, but I think it is rewriting us. Each night I hear it whisper through the floorboards. It uses our voices. It knows our names." Archivist's note. Recovered 1977, redacted 1989. Item H47-3, Henley Diary is sealed from public access. Partial transcription circulated among staff was stamped property of the U.S. Geological Survey. Requests for clarification were denied. Hollow Ridge was no longer a frontier settlement. By 1848 it had become a crucible, its inhabitants reshaped by the very ground they tilled. The disappearances continued, but they were no longer the greatest terror. The greater fear was this, that those who remained were changing too. By 1851, Hollow Ridge no longer resembled the settlement the Henleys had raised 2 decades before. The houses leaned inward, their porches sagging like watchers at a vigil. The copper seams in the soil bled green into the wells, staining buckets and kettles with rings of tarnish that would not scrub away. Travelers who passed through remarked that the town seemed hushed, as if its residents were forever listening for some hidden signal. More than one wrote in their journals that they could not bear to remain a night, for the air itself hummed, low and constant, like a faraway furnace, the turning inward. When the schoolhouse burned in 1848, families retreated into themselves, but by 1851 that isolation had curdled into something darker. Records show that the townsfolk abandoned civic gatherings. No more town meetings, no more public feasts. Even marriages became quiet affairs, performed in the back pews of the church without bells or celebration. Instead, households gathered privately, curtains drawn, candles lit, bowls of water set at the center of the room. Witnesses describe families reciting names in whispers, not prayers, but long genealogies, spoken as though to anchor themselves against erasure. In the surviving fragment of the Moss family Bible, entire pages are filled not with scripture but with obsessive lists. Nathaniel begat John, who begat Elias, who begat Ruth, who begat Miriam. The entries run backward as well as forward, repeating names until they blur. It was as if the people of Hollow Ridge feared that to forget a name was to invite it to vanish. The appearance of copper icons. Sometime around this year, the first copper effigies appear in the record. Archaeological recovery, in 1939, uncovered a set of small, crudely cast figures, each no larger than a hand. They resemble humans, though the faces are indistinct.
melted smooth. On several the spines are exaggerated ridges, carved with parallel lines like striations in ore. Local lore holds that these figures were placed in door frames or buried beneath thresholds. One was discovered wedged into the foundation of the Henley home, wrapped in linen that had long since decayed. Another was dug up beneath the roots of a poplar, its surface pitted as though it had sweated salt. The Whitlock papers rescued from the ruins of his house after his death contain a single line regarding them. Copper cast into shape of man, talisman, or confession. The disappearance of Sarah Henley. The defining event of this period was the disappearance of Sarah Henley herself. Her diary, so rich with trembling insight into Hollow Ridge's slow corruption, breaks off in July of 1851. The final entry reads only, "The voices have moved into the cellar. I hear them at the base of the stairs. They sound like family." Sarah's absence is not mentioned in the parish register, nor in county census rolls. It is as if her name was erased deliberately. Only in a letter written by her younger brother Thomas, years later from Kentucky, does she surface again. "We lost Sarah in midsummer, not to death, nor to marriage. She went below. Father would not let us speak her name after. Mother prayed over an empty chair until the day she passed." What below meant was never explained. Outside suspicion. By the early 1850s, outsiders had begun to suspect Hollow Ridge was concealing something. Traders from nearby counties complained that the settlement had grown unfriendly, refusing to barter, and that the goods they did sell, cheese, butter, cloth, carried a strange odor of metal. In 1852, a party of 3 tax assessors traveled to Hollow Ridge to survey holdings. Only 2 returned. Their report, filed in Lexington, is terse, community most uncooperative, hostile to inquiries. "We found evidence of irregular mining activities, not declared to the state. One of our party fell ill and could not complete the journey back. Cause unclear. Recommend no further visits without militia escort." The missing assessor, Mr. Hollings, was never located. His personal effects, including a watch and a brass button, were discovered years later in a creek bed a mile outside town, both coated with verdigris, as if they had lain underground for centuries, though they had been lost only months. Rituals of the Ridge. Accounts collected in the 20th century suggest that by 1853 Hollow Ridge had developed collective night gatherings. Families would emerge from their shuttered homes and walk silently to the edges of the copper seams where the soil split open. There they would stand in a ring holding lanterns that guttered in the wind. No prayers, no sermons, only silence. Some versions of the tale insist that they lowered offerings, food, jewelry, even livestock into the crevices. Others say they simply listened, waiting for the hum beneath the ground to deepen to answer. A miner's diary from 1901 recalls hearing these stories as a boy. They said the ridge was not mined but fed, that every offering made the copper run brighter, and every silence bought them another season without loss. The disappearance of Whitlock, Dr. Edmund Whitlock, whose instruments and journals had catalogued the unsettling medical anomalies of Hollow Ridge, vanished. His cabin was found abandoned, its shelves still lined with jars of preserved organs and bone samples labeled in his hand. But in the cellar, investigators discovered a makeshift operating table, the wood soaked through with dark stains. Above it, nailed to the rafters, hung dozens of sketches of skeletons etched with copper seams. One bore Sarah Henley's name. Pinned to the final page of his journal was a single note: "I will take the descent myself. If I do not return, know that the marrow carries the vein. We are not the end. We are the conduit." No trace of him was ever recovered. Closing unease. By the mid-1850s, Hollow Ridge had turned fully inward. It no longer sought visitors, no longer welcomed strangers. The settlement was a closed system, feeding on itself, sustained by rituals that no one outside could comprehend. And yet rumors leaked into surrounding counties, of copper-eyed children glimpsed at dusk, of fields where the soil rang when struck with a spade, of families who would not speak the names of their dead because they feared the dead were not gone. When asked about the town, an old woman in Winchester is said to have replied, "They are not waiting for salvation, they are practicing for return." Archivist's note recovered 1981, redacted 1991. Fragments of copper effigies, catalogued Jing USGS HR 51, currently held in restricted storage. Smithsonian Institution, access prohibited under federal mandate 8734. Descriptions of humanoid morphology remain classified. By 1855, Hollow Ridge had ceased to be a frontier settlement. It was something else entirely, a community rehearsing its own disappearance, binding itself to the veins of the mountain, vanishing one voice at a time. By 1857, Hollow Ridge had become a place of whisper. Travelers marked it on maps only to circle it in warning. Even the county lines, redrawn during that decade, seemed to bend away.
leaving the settlement in a cartographic limbo, present and absent at once. The census of that year lists fewer than 50 residents, yet journals from nearby towns speak of Hollow Ridge as full of movement. Its lanterns burning nightly, its paths worn deep by countless feet. The contradiction lingers like smoke, a town both dwindling and thrumming as if more lived there than records would allow. The Black Feast, the event most often cited as the turning point, was what later generations called the Black Feast. It was not a harvest celebration nor a funeral, though it bore marks of both. Accounts differ, but fragments suggest the community gathered in the ruined schoolyard one October night. Tables were laid with bread blackened by ash, meat salted to near inedibility, and cups filled with water drawn from the stained wells. No outsider witnessed it direct, yet in 1862, when Union soldiers briefly occupied the ridge, they found pits of scorched earth, charred bones of livestock mingled with what may have been human remains, and shards of copper vessels twisted by fire. A soldier's diary notes, "It was no feast for the living. It looked like an offering." Vanishing names. The years following grew stranger still. Parish records abruptly stopped in 18. No marriages, no baptisms, no burials. More unsettling is what followed. The deliberate erasure of names. Letters written by distant relatives to Hollow Ridge families were returned unopened. The names on the envelopes blacked out with soot. In one surviving example, the surname Henley has been burned away with acid, leaving a ragged hole in the paper. In folklore collected a century later, this period is remembered as the silence of the roll call. Parents supposedly forbade children from speaking their family names aloud after dark. Some say this was because the names no longer belonged to them, that the ridge itself had claimed the collapse of 1859. In the spring of 1859, a series of landslides tore through the upper seam. Miners in a nearby county reported hearing what sounded like a hollow roar, as if a cavern were breathing out. When dust settled, half the northern houses of Hollow Ridge were buried under red earth and copper stone. Rescue parties from Winchester were turned back at the ridge. Survivors, gaunt, copper-eyed, refusing aid, stood shoulder to shoulder across the road. Their silence was answer enough. Within weeks, Hollow Ridge was abandoned. At least, that is what the official county report declared. The township has dispersed, it reads. The land rendered uninhabitable by slide and famine. Yet for decades after, hunters spoke of lights moving across the buried streets at night. The last government visit. The final documented entry comes from 1863. In the thick of the Civil War, a detachment of Union engineers surveyed the ridge, considering it for a lookout post. They noted strange subsidence in the soil, deep cracks venting warmth even in winter. One captain wrote, "There are voices in the ground. I do not mean this figuratively. My men swear they heard chanting below, and when I pressed my ear to the seam, I confess I heard the same. It was not English nor any tongue I know. The site was deemed unstable, unfit for construction." The report was filed and buried in Washington archives. The captain, according to family accounts, never spoke of it again. Folklore of the aftermath. From the 1870s onward, Hollow Ridge belonged more to legend than to history. Children in surrounding counties were warned not to wander too close, lest the ridge count them among its own. Farmers avoided tilling near its slopes. In the early 20th century, treasure seekers pried into its ruin. They carried away copper effigies, charred stones, even bones with seams of verdigris threaded through. Most of these artifacts have vanished into private collections or museum vaults, locked and unlabeled. A few are rumored to curse their owners' illness, vanishing livestock, and one infamous case in which a man was found in his barn. Every tooth turned green. Erasure. By the time the federal surveyors returned in the 1930s, Hollow Ridge had been fully swallowed. The copper seams had collapsed inward, forming jagged depressions. What little remained of the houses lay flattened, indistinguishable from rubble. The town was struck from official records soon after. Maps ceased to print its name. Postal directories erased its code. By mid-century, only scattered references remained. Journal clippings, personal diaries, whispered stories passed through families who swore never to set foot there again. In 1981, a restricted Smithsonian inventory lists artifacts of humanoid morphology. Copper alloy, origin, Hollow Ridge, KY. The page is redacted in every subsequent release, closing unease. No graves have ever been found. No official death toll exists. By the measure of history, Hollow Ridge simply ceased, and yet the land does not rest. Hikers in the Daniel Boone National Forest still report a low hum when storms gather, a vibration in the soil that seems to travel up through the bone. Others tell of hearing their own names, whispered when they near the ridge, spoken in voices they cannot place. One folklorist, visiting in the 1990s, brought a tape recorder. At the edge of the collapsed scene, he asked aloud, "Who remains here?" On playback, a faint answer emerges beneath the wind: "All of us." To this day, Hollow Ridge is absent from modern maps, yet satellite images reveal a depression too regular to be natural, scarred in a copper hue against the forest. Official channels deny its existence, but the land remembers. The question lingers: was Hollow Ridge swallowed by the earth, or did its people choose to descend? And if so, what are they waiting for beneath us still? The collapse of 1859 did not end Hollow Ridge. It merely drove it deep. Letters discovered in the Winchester Medical Society archives, unlabeled, unsigned, sealed for nearly a century, suggest that several families did not leave after the slide. Instead, they retreated underground, into shafts once bored for copper, and into chambers that parish logs describe only as ancestral cellars. The ledger of Dr. W., a fragmentary ledger, survives, attributed to W., a physician who briefly practiced in Hollow Ridge between 1851 and he writes of births that left mothers split beyond repair, of infants whose bones bent like copper wire, of jaws too wide for their skulls. Several entries mention the use of forceps fashioned from the local ore, sharpened by friction, as if the seam itself requires its own tools for parturition. One chilling line appears 3 times in the ledger: "The children will not come in silent." Later annotations, in another hand, mark these passages with a single word: hereditary. The instruments. In 1873, decades after the ridge was declared abandoned, a collector in Lexington auctioned a set of obstetric instruments said to have been retrieved from Hollow Ridge. The catalogue describes them in cold inventory: 2 pairs of forceps, copper alloy, edges jagged, faintly corroded, a bone saw, teeth blunted not by rust but by something like grinding from within, calipers etched with notches inconsistent with human anatomy, a glass vial sealed with wax, residue inside greenish and viscous. The lot was sold to an anonymous bidder. None of the items have surfaced again. A marginal note in the auctioneer's ledger reads: "Buyer cautioned, handle not without gloves, heat persists." The surviving children. Folklore insists some of the Hollow Ridge children lived on, scattered through surrounding counties. Census fragments hint at this. Families with unfamiliar surnames appear briefly in records, then vanish by the next decade. Teachers wrote of pupils with unblinking copper-hued eyes, of an inability to sit through hymns, of strange humming noises emitted during lessons. One account from a schoolmistress in Estill County, 1866. When I asked how he knew, he replied that the scene told him. At recess he lay face down in the earth whispering. Medical Society response. The Kentucky Medical Journal, issue of 1874, includes a peculiar article later struck from reprint titled "On Peculiarities of Familial Degeneration in the Copper Region." It describes cases of families presenting with symmetrical malformations, copper pigmentation of sclera, and unaccountable vitality in tissue sample. The paper urges caution, recommending that any bloodlines traceable to Hollow Ridge be discouraged from propagation. Shortly after publication, the editor was removed from his post. Surviving correspondence suggests pressure from unnamed county officials, warning that dwelling on that place endangers more than reputation. The blood experiments. Among the restricted holdings of the Library of Congress, one can request, though rarely receive, a folder marked A. It contains chemical analyses conducted on samples labeled only Hollow Ridge. Notes describe blood that resists coagulation, cells that replicate after removal from host, and an odor akin to heated metal. One chilling marginalia, likely from a laboratory assistant, reads: "Even apart from the body, it still seeks consequences." By the turn of the century, whispers of Hollow Ridge resurfaced whenever congenital oddities plagued a family tree: hemophilia, brittle bone growths unspoken of in polite company. In each case, older relatives would murmur, "There is ridge in them." The community's erasure, it seems, was not complete. Its bloodlines had escaped, diluted into the general populace, but marked all the suppression. A revealing letter dated 1898 from a county clerk to the State Board of Health lays bare the official policy. We have agreed upon silence. Better the matter pass as local superstition than become a question for the newspaper. Families tainted by Hollow Ridge must not be catalogued. We are custodians of quiet, for the alternative is unrest, and unrest breeds inquiry. The letter bears a final note, ink blurred by age. Still the children do not come in silence.
The echo in modernity. Even today, descendants who suspect a connection to Hollow Ridge speak of dreams filled with copper light, of mouths crowded with extra teeth, of children born with uncanny awareness. Rural doctors in Kentucky still whisper about the ridge look, eyes metallic, blood reluctant to clot, a tendency to hum under anesthesia. No genealogy will admit this, no official archive preserves it. But in the margins, in redacted journals, in sealed medical files, the thread remains. Hollow Ridge did not perish in 1859. It transformed. It bled outward. It bred in silence. And every generation since, somewhere in Kentucky, a child is born who hums to the earth and listens for a scene that should not be heard. They thought themselves physicians, but they were only midwives to something older. It is unsigned. No hand claims it. And yet it directs us toward the records of Dr. whose ledger we encountered before, and to the strange circle of medical men who lingered at Hollow Ridge after its collapse. The Society of Quiet Practice. Between 1861 and 1865, a correspondence emerges among physicians in Kentucky, Ohio, and Virginia. The letters are coded, disguised as polite exchanges on botany and mineralogy. But beneath the harmless diction lies something else. Discussions of tinctures that resist flame, reports of newborns whose pulse cannot be counted in mortal rhythm, instructions for binding, suturing, restraining. This group styled itself the Society of Quiet Practice. Their seal, a copper forceps bound by a serpent, appears on wax fragments recovered in an estate sale in The men claimed they sought to understand hereditary corruption, but their methods betray another aim, not healing but continuation. The maternity vaults, several testimonies, half legible, scattered across county court records, describe vaults beneath Hollow Ridge lined with shelves and surgical benches. They are not confirmed, yet the consistency of the descriptions chills the blood. A miner deposed in 1870 swore he found a chamber lit by oil lamps, where women lay in rows, bellies swollen, tended by men in black coats. They hummed the same tune, he said, and the children that came out of them did not cry like ours. The court dismissed him as lunatic, yet a notation on the deposition reads simply, removed to Danville Asylum, do not release. Instruments of continuance. Among the Winchester College archives rests a vellum folder labeled Inventarium HR. It lists objects confiscated from the ridge before the mine was sealed. 6 pairs of surgical clamps, copper edges sharpened to needles, 3 glass retorts, each lined with a film that fluoresces faintly even now. 1 cradle, carved from ore, its base etched with measurements in inches and fractions. Assorted manuscripts, most pages singed, describing transfusion between mother and fetus and reversal of uterine exhaustion. Most chilling is entry 14, mask of linen, stiffened with dried secretion, retains heat. Who wore it, and why, remains unspoken. Testimony of Dr. An 1868 letter by Dr. P. of Louisville, published privately and immediately withdrawn, gives us the clearest window. The women of Hollow Ridge were not mere patients. They were vessels. They were tended with apparatus of a sort one encounters only in surgical theater, yet the aim was not delivery, but extension. The fetuses, several at once preserved in jars, appeared half-born, yet were measured, compared, and sometimes returned to the womb with new incision. I did not stay for the conclusion. This account was later denounced, yet its phrasing echoes too closely the ledger of Dr. B. To be dismissed. The Children's Choir. A disturbing report surfaces in the Danville Asylum logbook of several inmates formerly residents of Hollow Ridge were recorded as singing in unison during thunderstorms. Nurses complained the sound vibrated the glass in its frame. When physicians attempted to medicate them with laudanum, the choir grew louder, their jaws unhinging beyond natural hinge. The entry concludes, restraints ordered, hymns ineffective. The logbook breaks off mid-sentence. Pages 11-14, 1 to at least 7 have been excised. the paper cut cleanly. The question of heredity. Scientific journals of the late century wrestled with degeneration as a theory. In Paris, Lombroso wrote of criminals born marked. In London, Galton pressed the matter of eugenics. But in Kentucky, among those who knew Hollow Ridge, heredity bore another meaning. Not criminality, not mere frailty, but continuance of the unnameable. One provincial paper suppressed after a single printing posed the question plainly. If a lineage can be bent, might it be forged? If the womb is a crucible, what then of the Smiths? Consequences in the counties. From 1870 through 1890, isolated families in Powell and Estill counties suffered outbreaks of the Ridge look. Infants born with tongues too broad, unable to suckle yet humming constant. Toddlers who attempted to eat soil and small stones, later expelling them unbroken. Adolescents whose teeth erupted in layers, crowding the jaw. Local midwives whispered of Ridge blood, yet parish records never named it. Margins simply read, "Child did not come in silent." Suppression redoubled. By the end of the century, state officials moved to erase. Parish registers blacked out. Birth ledgers amended. The asylum in Danville ordered total redaction of Hollow Ridge names, yet silence breeds suspicion, and suspicion lingers. A final memorandum dated 1902 states, Hollow Ridge must not be taught, families must not inquire, let the silence stand, for the alternative is inquiry, and inquiry returns us to the vaults. The memorandum is unsigned. Its wax seal shows the faint impression of force. The Ridge endured, not only in bone and blood, but in method, an entire philosophy of heredity, written in copper and flesh. Their aim was not survival, but return. And as we peer into their vaults, through ledgers and clamps and humming children, we must ask, what precisely were they trying to bring back? A brittle clipping from the Winchester Courier, dated September 1874, opens this portion. A sickness stalks the valleys, though no physician names it. Infants arrive into the world neither in joy nor in death, but in some third condition that unsettles even the devout. The mothers avert their eyes, the fathers will not speak, and in every hollow, hymns fall silent when the wind carries their sound. The paper was withdrawn within a week. Of the issue itself, only 3 exemplars remain. A case from Powell County, the asylum's bound folio, admissions ledger, 1875 preserves a case labeled Family, Powell Co., Patient, Infant, Sex uncertain, Condition, Birth recorded as viable yet errant. Noted abnormality, the skin mottled, thickened in patches, pulse present but faintly echoing twice within each beat. Remark, sang upon first breath, tone matched pitch of mother's hum at time of labor. The nurse who made this notation was later dismissed for delirium, yet in her private letter to her sister, she added, "The child smiled before it opened its eyes, and when I turned it to swaddle, its teeth had already formed beneath the gums, pressing visibly against the flesh." The Winchester Society Proceedings. Among the most disturbing fragments is an article, immediately censored, from the Proceedings of the Winchester Medical Society, Winter Session 8. It describes an adolescent girl, age 13, of Ridge descent. She had grown teeth in second row, overlapping the first. Calipers show measurements exceeding natural proportion. The society debated whether this condition was congenital or induced. One physician remarked, "She is not ill, but she is not of us." She persists. The article was struck from the bound volume, but a single galley proof survived in the archives of a deceased dentist, where it was discovered decades later. The hidden ledger of Dr. W. We return again to Dr. W., whose first ledger showed the mechanics of Ridge practice. A second book, water-stained and scorched, adds the human consequence. Entry dated March 1878. The choir has spread beyond control. In 3 houses the children sing in tones untrained, identical in pitch though separated by wall. Mothers report waking with tongues swollen as if in sympathy with the young. Infants exchange breath through closed lips, refusing nourishment, unless the hymn continues. I have applied ether, clamps and fasting, but the sound endures. A marginal hand, possibly his wife's, writes in smaller script, "It will outlive us." The festival incident. Local lore recalls a harvest festival in Stanton 8. Several families gathered in the churchyard. At dusk, as the congregation sang, one Ridge child raised his voice an octave higher. To the astonishment of those present,
Every ridge-born child followed in unison. Witnesses swore the pitch cracked the stained glass window above the pulpit. The window did not shatter, but a vein-like fissure spread from corner to corner, resembling an umbilical cord. The congregation dispersed in terror. The children were never again allowed to sing publicly. Within weeks, parish records note attendance diminished. Ridge families absent, whispered midwives. In the hills, away from county physicians, midwives kept their own records. A fragmentary journal, later deposited anonymously to the Kentucky Historical Society, includes recipes, births, and warnings. Do not cut the cord too soon, else the child will sicken. Bury not the afterbirth whole, for it hums in the soil. When the ridge blood comes, tie the wrists of the mother, else she will claw at her own belly to pull them forth. The handwriting changes abruptly on the final page. A different hand scrawls only. It sings Stephen in earth. Consequences beyond Hollow Ridge. By 1880, state officials acknowledged an abnormal rate of infant mortality in 3 counties. Though the term mortality is misleading, many of these children did not perish, but departed. Families reported waking to find cradles empty, doors unlatched, no tracks in the mud outside. Dogs howled for nights after. No remains were recovered. In the official census of 1880, a footnote records, several families omitted due to absence of children. No explanation followed. The hereditary petition, a group of physicians, uneasy at what they observed, petitioned the state board in their request, mandatory inspection of all ridge-born infants, to determine degeneracy or contagion. The petition was denied, yet the names of the signatories are telling. Half were later struck from medical rolls. 1. Dr. Peer, already noted for his testimony, was found drowned in the Kentucky River, weighted with calipers. The coroner ruled suicide, but among his effects lay a folded sheet, scrawled with a diagram of a child's jaw, 3 rows of teeth, marked with careful fractions. Fragment of a sermon, from Reverend T. Powell County, 1880. They come to us clothed in breath, yet not of breath. Their song is not a song of praise but a calling, and it is not God they call. The church elders struck these lines from the printed sermon, but the draft remained in his desk until his death. The gathering silence. By the close of the decade, Hollow Ridge was a name no one spoke. Families relocated or altered their surnames. Parish ledgers used dashes instead of names. And yet in the archive of the asylum, one chilling line closes the decade. The experiment persists, though none admit it. The choir is larger, the tune more certain, the pulse doubled, continuance assured. Thus the consequence of the ridge is not death, nor sickness, but propagation. Their marks spread quietly, reshaping bone, teeth, song and memory. It was not a curse alone but a project, one that succeeded. And the question whispers forward, if they spread in silence then, where are their descendants now? The archives of 1885 are curiously blank. Entire parish registers end mid-sentence. Asylum folios show scorched margins. The gaps themselves are testimony. Someone tried very hard to end the ridge story here, but the fragments that remain speak louder than silence. The Winchester fire. In January of that year, the Winchester Medical Society lost its hall to a sudden fire. Official reports call it an accident, chimney defect, exacerbated by high wind, yet multiple witnesses swore that men had been seen carrying satchels of kerosene into the rear vestry. Among the ash, one unburned scrap was recovered. Experiments of Hollow Ridge indicate a persistence of traits beyond 3 generations, not diminishing, but compounding. To excise is futile, to suppress is required. The scrap is marked, property of the Winchester Medical Society, confidential, 1884. Confrontation at the asylum. The Eastern Kentucky Asylum faced its own reckoning in March 1880. Testimony survives only in shorthand, much of it crossed through. One legible line, the children do not die, they continue. If removed, they return. If silenced, they resound elsewhere. It is not heredity alone but redact. At that word the ink thickens, as if the stenographer blotted the page. The board dismissed him the following day. No public reason given. He disappeared from records thereafter. The Stanton Church Incident. April 1885. The First Church of Stanton gathered for Easter Vigil. Parishioners describe a night of candlelight, hymns and solemnity. But when the hymn "Christ the Lord is Risen Today" began, the Ridge children, seated apart by custom, sang in a second key, dissonant yet perfect. The sound grew until it drowned the organ. One mother fainted, another covered her child's mouth and fled. The sexton in a panic struck the bell to drown the sound, but the bell cracked on its second toll. The parish minutes record only. Service adjourned by disorder. Bell unusable henceforth. Suppressed petition. A letter survives in draft form, never sent, from Reverend T. to the state governor. If you do not intervene, we shall. The families breed a contagion not of body but of blood and soul. Their offspring are neither fully human nor wholly other. They draw breath, yet breathe differently. They sing yet summon. We cannot permit continuance. The draft breaks into ink blots as though written in haste. No final version is known. The mob at Hollow Ridge. By summer, tensions broke. Counts differ, but multiple oral histories recount a mob descending on the ridge hamlets, torches, axes, and shovels in hand. They demanded the abominations be destroyed, yet when they reached the largest homestead, an abandoned tobacco barn, they found it empty. Only straw, discarded cradles, and a circle of burned hymnals remained. One witness claimed to hear children laughing in the woods. Another swore a lullaby drifted over the fields. Though no singer was seen, the mob burned the barn to the ground anyway. Parish records call its settlement erased, but the Ridge families were not accounted for. Testimony of Nurse Ellery. Hidden in the asylum folio is the resignation letter of Nurse Margaret Ellery, dated August 1885. I tended them, I swaddled them, I placed clamps, calipers, forceps, but they would not remain restrained. Their jaws widened, their song broke ether itself. I swear the vapor dispersed when they sang. I am leaving. To stay is to serve continuance, and I will not. She fled Kentucky thereafter. Her name appears in Boston directories 2 years later, but never again in medical service.
The Red Ledger. The most damning artifact is known only as the Red Ledger, bound in calfskin, pages marked property of E.K. Asylum, 1885. Entries are Kurt, child number 47, released to unknown custody, returned within fortnight, unchanged in age. Child number 51, teeth erupted, 3 rows, extraction attempted, regrowth immediate. Child number 53 sang entire hymn alone, no prior teaching, pitch matched earlier cohort. Final entry scrawled across the page in red ink. They do not perish, they persist. Continuance is their inheritance. Stop this now or it will not stop at all. The ledger's provenance is disputed, but fragments of it circulate among collectors even today. State suppression. By autumn, officialdom acted. The Board of Health issued an extraordinary directive. All records pertaining to anomalous births in Powell, Wolf, and Clark counties are to be sealed. Dissemination prohibited. Breach punishable by removal from roll. Simultaneously, the asylum's east wing was closed. Patients transferred elsewhere. The wing itself was bricked, its wards silent. No one admitted why. The whispered exile. Oral traditions claim surviving Ridge families were not killed, but escorted under guard to remote hollows in Breathitt County. Some say barges carried them downriver by night, bound for destinations unknown. Others whisper that they simply melted into surrounding towns, altering surnames, changing church allegiance, blending into the body of Kentucky. If so, their continuance may not have ended. It may only have scattered. Here the climax gathers: fire to holes, mobs to barns, suppression by state decree. Yet the Ridge legacy proved resistant. It was not so easily burned, bricked, or buried. The question now sharpens: if erasure failed in 1885, what remains hidden, renamed, but still alive? Hollow Ridge. If 1885 was the year of suppression, then 1886 was the year of revelation. What had been hidden in sealed ledgers, bricked wings, and scorched churches began to surface again, not as rumor, but as material evidence. Each object bore witness, each contradicted the official silence. The ledger resurfaces. In February 1886, a bookseller in Lexington catalogued a strange calfskin volume among a shipment of theological folios. Inside were lists of infants, marked only by numbers and cryptic notes. The bookseller sold it for pennies, unaware of its import. Within months, the volume was identified by a professor of anatomy at Transylvania University. His marginalia survives on the flyleaf. If genuine, this confirms the persistence of Ridge children into successive cohorts. Note similarity of dentition anomalies. Monograph on supernumerary eruption, 1878, the state must be made aware. Weeks later, the professor was found drowned in the Kentucky River. The ledger vanished again. The sealed wing breached. That same spring, masons repairing the Eastern Kentucky Asylum's east wing uncovered a bricked chamber. Inside were rusted iron beds, cracked basins, and fragments of bone saws. On the wall scrawled in chalk, a phrase repeated in uncertain hands: "We do not perish." The masons reported the discovery. By morning the wall was resealed, their wages paid in full, and they were instructed never to speak of it. One of them decades later recounted it to his grandson, who carried the tale into oral history projects of the Bell of Stanton. Meanwhile, the cracked Bell of Stanton was sold for scrap, but the foundryman tasked with melting it swore the metal sang as it was heated. He described a resonance within the crucible, as though a hymn without words vibrated through the iron. Alarmed, he abandoned the job, selling the bell fragments quietly to a blacksmith. The pieces disappeared into farm implements scattered across the county. To this day, collectors whisper that Ridge iron carries a hymn if struck at midnight. The Hollow Ridge Journal. The most damning evidence came from within the families themselves. In May 1886, a handwritten journal surfaced, authored by a Ridge matron identified only as M.R. Her words: "They come for us with fire, with hymn, with decree, but the children persist. They do not sicken as others. They do not forget songs never taught. They speak in unison when no word was given. This is continuance, and continuance will not be denied. I do not fear for them. I fear for those who would oppose." The journal was confiscated by county authorities, but a clerk copied 2 pages before surrendering it, preserving them in his private papers. Those pages remain in the university archive today, though stamped, restricted, handled by permission only. The Reverend's confession. A final revelation came from once the fiercest advocate for state action. In July 1886, racked with illness, he summoned a parish deacon and dictated a confession. The deacon wrote faithfully, "I urged their eradication, yet I knew even then it could not be done. Their voices enter the marrow. Their presence lingers after absence. I sought to expel what could not be expelled. I confess my failure, and I confess my dread, for the continuance is no longer theirs alone. I feel it in myself." The Reverend died that autumn. His confession, sealed in the vestry chest, was rediscovered only in night patterns beyond the ridge. Medical reports of 1886 show anomalies outside Powell and Wolfe counties. In Fayette, a boy born with triple rows of molars. In Clark, a girl who sang entire liturgies though mute, until that hour. In each case, midwives whispered the same: "The ridge has spread." Doctors, fearful of losing license, noted only idiopathic presentation, but the pattern was plain. Continuance had left Hollow Ridge. The Winchester meeting. In November 1886, a clandestine meeting of physicians convened in Winchester. Minutes were recorded on onion skin paper, stamped, "Private circulation." One key exchange: Dr. H. "We attempted isolation, futile." Dr. L. "Then extermination." H. "Also futile." Dr. L. "What remains?" Dr. H. "Acceptance." The minutes end with a resolution to strike the matter from record, to live beside continuance as one lives beside weather or plague. The page is torn thereafter. Final testimony of Nurse Ellery. One last voice belongs again to Nurse Margaret Ellery, writing now from Boston in 1886. In a letter to a colleague she wrote, "They thought removal would end it. They thought silence would seal it, but it is not bounded by ridge, ward or ledge. I hear their song even here, above the Charles, faint and steady. Continuance travels. You cannot burn it, cannot bury it. It will reach you." Her letter is held in the Massachusetts Historical Society. It bears her name, her hand, her dread. Thus the climax sharpens into revelation. Artifacts reappear, journals leak, confessions contradict. The Ridge story refused suppression. What was meant to be erased only spread wider. We arrive now at the precipice. The final part must reckon with collapse, not of the Ridge alone, but of those who sought to bury it. And still the question presses: did continuance survive into our own age? The story must end here, though it does not end. Collapse of the family. By the final winters of the 19th century, the Ridge families no longer appeared as households in census tables. Names that had filled baptismal registers, crop ledgers and tax rolls were suddenly absent, but their vanishing was not dispersal in the ordinary sense. Parish priests recorded entire households gone to silence.
with no forwarding kin, no graves. Marginal notes appear in 2 parishes, removed by order, and elsewhere, all extinguished. Yet correspondence from surrounding counties contradicts these laconic entries. Midwives in Clark, Bourbon, and Fayette whisper of infants born with the ridge anomalies, double pupils, mirrored voices, premature dentition. The families did not perish, they dissolved into the broader body, like tincture in water. Collapse of the experiment. Medical fascination faltered too. By 1891, the Kentucky Medical Association quietly withdrew its circular on hereditary curiosity. Journals that once published fevered accounts of the ridge anomaly began to print only retractions, corrections, and finally, nothing at all. Yet in the archives of Louisville, one finds boxes, stamped property of the Commonwealth, not for circulation. Within, surgical forceps worn smooth, fetal calipers bent at odd angles, jars of fluid clouded with unnamed tissue. On many a stenciled word appears, continuance. The experiment had not concluded. It had been subsumed into institutional silence. Collapse of the records. Around the turn of the century, a last effort was made to cleanse the archives. Folios relating to Hollow Ridge were pulled from courthouses, vestries, and schools. Some were burned, others sealed, but archivists leave traces even in erasure. In the Powell County Registry, a sequence of numbers runs missing, birth 1704 to birth 1806, all excised. A clerk, perhaps weary, scrawled a note at the margin, "You cannot cut absent." Elsewhere, a university catalogue from 1902 lists a volume as Accidents of the Ridge, location redacted, author redacted. The title remains though the body is gone. Suppression fails in its own handwriting. The last survivor speaks. In 1907, a woman named Elizabeth R., recorded as aged 84, was interviewed by a folklorist collecting ballads in the foothills. She sang fragments of hymns unfamiliar to the collect. When asked their origin, she replied, "We were taught beneath the ground. When bells were silenced, my mother's mouth was sewn, but she sang still. We were made to continue." The folklorist dismissed her as seen, yet he noted, uneasily, that her 2 great-grandsons bore unusual eyes, not disfigured, but doubled as if the iris had been etched twice. Into the 20th century, traces continue. A 1912 medical pamphlet from Chicago describes a boy with polyphonic utterance, his throat producing simultaneous tones. A 1924 asylum ledger from Ohio lists a patient who spoke in chorus with no present interlocutors. Neither text mentions Hollow Ridge, but both are annotated in pencil, ridge stock. The implication is plain. The families had mingled outward, yet continuance expressed itself still. The archivist's burden. Today, in restricted stacks and sealed cabinets, the ridge survives in fragment. A bell shard at the Kentucky Historical Society hums faintly when struck. A child's shoe recovered from the bricked wing is stamped EK Asylum property. Journals lie under glass, pages blurred by redaction but margins whispering still. And in whispered tours of local history, guides admit, almost playfully, the ridge blood runs still. You may meet them in the street. So ends the Hollow Ridge account, or rather so ends what the records permit. Families erased, yet diffused, experiments suppressed, yet archived. A story of continuance, inheritance that refused extinction. But remember, erasure is never complete. Objects surface, songs return, traits emerge in generations thought far removed. If you hear a voice singing in unison with your own, if you see in a neighbor's eyes a second iris faintly shadowed, recall this history. The ridge has not ended, it has only dispersed. Continuance endures.